question that we would be posing to the AIIB team is, can this asset class deliver before it's too late? Moreover, we're beginning to grapple with something else. It's how do we price nature? And that's a thorny subject because we're bringing the market economy into this. But can the market economy truly protect and deliver greater equity or actually be part of a bigger problem? Remember, we trusted finance once with something quite sacred to us, our homes, and we had the subprime financial crisis. So we are all here, bankers, economists, but if we go outside this cocooned world, there is a trust issue with people outside of how do we convince them that we can be, as bankers, good guardians of nature. If we get this right, it would be extraordinarily revolutionary. If we get it wrong, it could be catastrophic. So no mean feat for the team, not putting pressure on Eric or JP here. But before this, let me introduce you to this exceptional panel that we have today. We are joined by Her Excellency Dr. Rania Al-Mashat, Egypt's Minister of International Cooperation since December 2019, and previously served as the country's first Minister for Tourism. First female, let's just get that one right, for tourism. And she will talk to us about her new program, Egypt's Country Platform, launched in July 2020, which is doing something quite innovative. It's actually interlinking, creating a nexus between climate change, biodiversity, food, and water. Next to her, we are joined by another powerhouse, Aban Marka Kabraji, UN's Asia-Pacific Senior Advisor on Biodiversity and Climate Change, and advisor to the AIIB on these issues. She was Regional Director of the Asia Regional Office of the International Union for Conservation of Nature, and a thought leader in the field of nature as infrastructure. Next to her, finally, the men are popping up, is Simon Zadok, who is Executive Director of Nature Finance and co-lead of the Secretariat for the Task Force on Nature Markets. And they just brought out a critical report last month, which was launched at the Regional Summit for the Amazon Rainforest Alliance held in Brazil. And it gave some absolutely fundamental recommendations on how to shape a new generation of markets that conserve rather than destroy nature. And we leave, well, dare I say the last to the, I don't know. We'll go for Eric Berkloff, Chief Economist of the AIIB, and he is going to present the report, joined by his lovely colleague, Zhang Ping Tia, who is a lead economist in the group. So over to you, Eric.
Thank you and Sama for that introduction and giving this energy to this session. It's an incredible opportunity for us to get feedback. You didn't say so, but this is not the final product. We are still working on it, and particularly we're thinking about how to make the messages more precise. So it's a very valuable opportunity for us to interact with you today. So we think that this is a very important shift in the way of thinking about infrastructure. You mentioned the visit yesterday to the museum here locally, and you could see that thousands of years of civilization here, and that civilization has been served by one river, the River Nile, and that river provided a lot of infrastructure in so many ways. Another example is the example of the Indus River in Pakistan, another civilization supported by a river. It was flooded, as you know, last year, and there's a lot of evidence that those floods were made much worse because of human interventions in the way Indus provided infrastructure for Pakistan. So that's a kind of background I want to have you think about how nature as infrastructure really changes your perspective on infrastructure. So I don't think you need to hear again these statistics that we have lost 2/3 of species. It's the worst extinction of species since the dinosaurs. Infrastructure is often implicated in this destruction of species, that we're building roads, we are developing agricultural infrastructure into areas that are very rich in biodiversity, and there are these conflicts. And we wanted to look more closely at those and also understand, as Sama was saying, how can we work with nature rather than against nature? So that gives us this spectrum that you have between, on the one hand, what we call gray infrastructure, cement and steel and so on, and then on the other side you have natural solutions like using wetlands as flood barriers, mangroves against tidal waves and so on. And we wanted to explore both how can we reduce these conflicts, how can we build in natural solutions into grey infrastructure, but of course also how can we think of genuine natural infrastructure, or nature as infrastructure. So the way we proceeded was to say, let's do some research work and look at the data. And it turns out that there is actually quite a lot of data. We're particularly grateful. Sorry, we are going a little bit too fast here. So how do I go back? Okay, wonderful. Thank you. So we wanted to look at the data. So the World Bank, for example, has built 20 years of data, and we were able to work with their team and have done some work that they have not had a chance to do yet, trying to understand the impact of natural capital on growth, on creditworthiness of countries, also look at the infrastructure impact on nature and the biodiversity in specific geographic context. Also trying to find, how can we, using the traditional method for cost-benefit analysis, how can we include natural capital in that, and how does it change how we view specific projects, and we look at projects in our own pipeline. We wanted to also get, what are the potential solutions? We want to look at some case studies where nature really works as infrastructure. We also want to think about this notion of nature-positive investment. So far, a lot of biodiversity, nature thinking in multilateral development banks have been about how do we make sure that we don't damage and try to reduce damage and bring down the negative impact. But we want to think about nature-positive contribution. How can we use a road or a water utility? How can we build in elements there that actually enhances biodiversity? And it's possible. We'll show you some cases of that. And finally, we want to understand specifically also what are the impacts that we are having from our activities as a multilateral development banks. So I don't want to go into each individual chapter, but these are the chapters that we are working with, and what we want to show you is that you can use this concept of nature as infrastructure, pushing it in several different directions. It's moving again. I don't know how. So we look at, as I said, we look at natural capital, including that in growth estimation. How does that change how we think about growth? How does it change productivity? What is the contribution of natural capital compared to other things? What is the ecological impact of infrastructure? How do firms' behavior when it comes to biodiversity and nature influence their stock prices? How can we think of nature as infrastructure? You look at specific examples. This China's Sanbei reforestation project. We look at Indonesia's mangroves. We look at Bangladesh wetlands, we look at Egyptian mangroves and so on. So trying to understand in specific cases what does nature deliver and what is the value of what the nature delivers. You associate nature a lot with, of course, cities are removed from nature, you would think, and there's not much you can do. But we actually do some work showing that these cities can work in very different ways. You can design green areas in cities to enhance biodiversity. You can enrich, depending on how you construct these green areas, you can have very different impact on biodiversity, and also a lot of co-benefits, cleaner air obviously, but also flood protection and those kind of things. We, as I said, apply cost-benefit analysis, the traditional tool, to projects in our pipeline and look at how do they look with the traditional method, how do they look if you apply this natural capital approach. And finally, we try to understand better, so countries that have these natural assets, they should be valued and they should affect their creditworthiness. So we know a number of examples, of course, now of countries that have been able to use the fact that they have some unique natural resources and use that to reduce their debt level, for example. At the same time, there is also this vulnerability that these richness of natural resources or biodiversity makes you more vulnerable to natural disaster, for example, and how does that affect creditworthiness? So this is the whole span of issues that we are looking at. So very quickly, these are the main messages that we have. There's an absolute need for having a much more serious approach to valuing nature, and I think we have introducing some elements in the report that will help you do that, and how we can better incorporate these assessments into investment and development decisions, and how can we incentivize and help enhance the protection of nature. How can we do grey infrastructure greener? So that's about combining traditional solutions, for example, for flood protection with natural. So how can we mitigate, where we have brown sites, or where we are already doing harm to nature? Can we minimize that? Animal crossings over roads, for example, have shown to be a very good way to sustain biodiversity when you build roads. So let me. This clicker has some imperfections. Maybe there's a natural way to look at this. It has its own. It's very sensitive. Can you go back? Sorry. Sorry. Okay. So nature's infrastructure. We want infrastructure to be nature wherever possible, wherever it makes economic sense. And Sama mentioned those numbers that often nature is much cheaper and much more sustainable. Very important, we need to work with local communities, because they are often the ones who know how to run these ecosystems, and they have been living with these ecosystems for centuries, and it's very important to understand that knowledge of things. We need to find ways of monetizing wherever possible these natural resources to enhance financial sustainability. We'll hear more about this in the panel discussion, but there are a lot of innovative ways now to finance these kind of investments. To how to, and for that we need proper pricing for the use of nature. We need to tax harm on nature. We need to think about how can we do performance-linked bonds, like you have done here in Egypt. Egypt agreed to ratchet up its commitment under the NDCs, under the Paris Agreement, against cheaper finance from Germany. That's just one example, and there are many, or some more out there, and we need to have many more of them. Debt for nature swaps, Belize has done a very innovative transaction where it managed to reduce its debt level from very high level to much lower level, and get rid of some of the most expensive debt by committing to take care of some areas. I don't need to say it. Obviously, we think that MDBs can play a very important role in this. I'm going to give the floor now to JP or Jianping, who has been leading this work, just to give you some little tidbits from the report. Watch out.
Thanks so much.
Very sensitive.
Yeah. Good evening, audience, and good evening, panel minister. It is really not easy to speak after your boss. But let me start by thanking Eric for pushing this topic into my professional life in the last year and really bringing this topic to the bank, to the development committee, and assembling a panel of experts whom I've interacted with and benefited a lot. I look forward to hearing from them later. I'm going to be very brief. I'm not going to go through 7 chapters. I'm going to be very brief so that you'll read the report when it comes out. So I'm going to start with the macro, right? So you are very used to seeing that a growth is explained by physical capital, infrastructure. Next one. Okay, you are very used to seeing growth being explained by physical infrastructure, human capital, labor. So we ask the question, does nature matter for growth? So by using the World Bank data set assembled very carefully, when we put it into a growth regression, and the answer is yes. Nature contributes to countries' growth. Depleting nature harms countries' long-term growth. And this is the key message that we're going to say in the report. And what's more important, very important point, when you look at the valuation of nature, it is much smaller than its actual contribution in terms of the capital stock. Nature is grossly undervalued compared to the services that it provides to us. So what does it mean? Investing in nature pays. It pays to do it now for your long-term growth. So this is a message that will come out very strongly in the report. Let me quickly jump. But we didn't want to stop at the top level macro. We wanted to be very, very specific, and we wanted to collect ground level data. So we are very grateful that nowadays there are very good satellite level data that allow us to track projects. We map all the infrastructure projects, geocoded them and mapped them into nature, and we allows us a resolution as to which are the projects, which are the sectors that are harming nature. It gives us a sense of risk, allow us to aggregate at the sectoral or at the country level, and then find mitigations. So this will come out again very strongly in the report using satellite data and so on to really track infrastructure's impact on nature. There are many, many interesting ground-up micro examples, too many to say, but I would just like to quickly highlight one very interesting project we did for China. So my colleague here, Jingyu, he went to the Sunbay project, right? So he collected ground-level data on the tree planting in China. China is planting trees to stop the dust from coming. So he collected meteorological data, he collected ground level, kind of county level output data, tree planting data, combined with satellites, giving us a very, very rich set of data to see what is the program, what's the impact of growing these trees in the north of China. And we have a booth set up at the end, so please feel free to interact with us. We have another presentation at 9 o'clock tomorrow morning to really showcase nature as infrastructure, using trees to, for example, prevent the desertification in northern China and the effects of that. I'm also very glad to see that, I didn't know that in Egypt, that it's actually mangrove. Coming from Singapore, I thought mangrove is a tropical thing. And we showcase an example whereby the restorations of mangrove in the Red Sea actually led to economic benefits. Farmers were using the mangroves to grow bees, to harvest bees and the honey. It's highlighting the core benefits of nature. We have examples from India, we have examples of Bangladesh wetland. There are too many examples, top down, bottom up. Like I said, I don't want to give away everything. I hope to hear from the panelists, and then hope that you watch out for this space and look for the launch of the report. With that, thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you. Thank you very much, JP. And I would like, please, to ask Haban for her viewpoints on this.
Thank you, Sama. Well, I've looked at the report, been through it in as much detail as was supplied, and I'd like to really address two of the points the report makes. Now, if everyone here hasn't actually seen the slides, then I can only assume that at some point they'll be made available to everybody. But one of them I think Eric did put up, and that was, and you've spoken about it as well, about mangroves in Bangladesh. And the point I want to make there is that natural infrastructure has actually been used by countries for many, many decades. And it's only recently that it's being spoken about in this particular language. And to give you an illustration, I'd like to talk about, Bangladesh. I'm sure many of you remember that up to the 1990s or so, there used to be regular typhoons in Bangladesh that had huge costs in terms of the economy and in terms of population. Hundreds and thousands of people over the many recurrent typhoons that used to come up the Bay of Bengal meant human lives were lost in fairly disastrous numbers. Suddenly you hear nothing about that anymore. You just don't. It's not that the typhoons have stopped. And 2 decades ago, climate change was not the kind of impact it has now in terms of sea level rise in Bangladesh. The typhoons have not stopped. Bangladesh did 2 things. First, they brought in a very rudimentary early warning system, which worked. But secondly, they went into massive plantation of mangroves in the delta. And they estimate now that storm surges, which previously, because the mangroves were not in as good condition, this is the Sundarbans, of course, were not in as good condition as they are now. Every storm surge used to go up to about 20 to 30 kilometers up into the delta, and obviously everything, any human population, agriculture was wiped out year after year. They brought the mangroves back, they restored them. The same storm surges now flatten about 10 kilometers because the mangroves are so strong that they hold back the sea. So here's an example of natural infrastructure that was brought in many decades ago, restored, and is serving an extremely useful purpose. You find examples like this all over the world. It's now that they're being recognized in terms of their true economic value, in terms of their resilience, in terms of their natural restoration, because you don't have to go in and bring cement and dikes and steel to keep the sea back. They grow back naturally if they're allowed to. And here is natural infrastructure which countries in many cases, particularly in the global south, have been practicing for decades. They need to be valued, they need to be recognized, and countries themselves need to bring them up to scale, particularly in the global south where most of the biodiversity of the world exists and therefore the greatest opportunities for restoration. The second point I want to make is Eric mentioned this, the whole shift from gray infrastructure to green infrastructure to natural infrastructure. Gray infrastructure is your traditional cement, steel, fossil fuel nexus. And yes, it's necessary. You probably couldn't build a safe bridge today without that particular combination of materials. Rope bridges for orangutans are fine. They don't work for most human beings and for trucks. So there are limitations. But then beyond that, there is the grey infrastructure which is greened. You make it as green as possible. You incorporate as much as you can of green infrastructure. And then there's the ultimate, what everybody would like to see happening more of, if not all of, which is natural infrastructure, which is your wetlands, your floodplains, your river systems, and and there are many examples. The watersheds, the usefulness of having reed beds as filtration devices, and so on and so forth. So, how much is AIIB really along that spectrum? And I think what Eric's report and what JP's report is presenting is that they're shifting and they're trying to see how best they make that transition. And they're probably one of the first MDBs that I have seen that is doing it in such a deliberate fashion. And so I think from that point of view, it's a very interesting example we're looking at the moment. So I'll stop there. Simon?
Thank you very much, Aban. Eloquently put, indeed. Simon, over to you.
Now I'm spoiled. Thanks very much indeed. So I'll build a little bit on the comments that have been made, sort of leveraging from Eric's presentation, but also kind of particularly leaning into the discussion about finance, because obviously the critical issue is the role of biodiversity and more broadly nature as an infrastructure to our society, the need to shift towards it, but ultimately that raises the question of finance. Just a couple of numbers reinforce some of your earlier highlights. You know, a major cause of biodiversity destruction is the way in which we grow food, or more broadly, soft commodities. So that would include cotton and logging and so on and so forth. The World Bank estimates that we have roughly an $8 trillion a year food system. So that's the whole food system, not just the production side. And they estimate externalities valued at roughly $6 trillion. So just a little bit less than the total financialized value of the food system globally. Now, it doesn't really matter whether the number is precisely right, whether it should be 4 or 5 or 6 or 7. The observation is that when you add up nature, climate, and public health externalities, so those are the 3 blocks, with nature being a major piece of the story, actually the way in which we grow food in many parts of the world today is addicted to the destruction of nature. And so although we come here with a lens of nature as infrastructure, we need to think about the way in which markets and industries exist. We can't simply solve the problem at the bottom of the pipeline. We have to think how markets themselves need to change over time. Think of food commodity markets as another related example. Even although we have central banks around the world today beginning to take nature and climate into account in their work, there isn't a commodity regulator on the planet that takes any notice of anything to do with nature or climate in the way in which our global food commodity markets work. So these are, if you like, upstream, systemic changes that need to accompany the project level investments that are rich in opportunity, as Eric and Aban and JP have already highlighted. Eric made the observation there are lots of interesting ways to finance nature. And I want to just make perhaps just 2-3 brief comments and then pass back to you. Firstly, yes, we're interested in how private finance can flow into nature. But that's not an obsession. Remember, 20% or so of global GDP is made up of public expenditure. Yeah, so we have many, many trillions of dollars of public procurement, all of which can be aligned more effectively to supporting nature-positive outcomes in the way in which they feed into positive economic and livelihood outcomes. But if we turn briefly to financial markets, I'd mention 2 or 3 pieces of the story. The first, perhaps, seemingly negative, are moves that have developed over the last 3 or 4 years to try and push the financial community to at least take account of nature as a risk. So you have an asset, it may be a farm, it may be a factory, it may be some other part of a global supply chain. How dependent is that on nature's bounty? To what extent is your economic asset, or value creation process at risk? Now we see the beginnings of a set of standards emerging that will push the financial community to at least count nature as a risk or a financial risk, perhaps not fully across to that valuation model that Eric and JP have been highlighting. And then perhaps at a sort of a next level up, particularly in sovereign debt markets, where countries' economic prosperity, as JP said, depends on the continuation of nature's bounty. That's obvious in a country like Brazil, it's obvious in a country like Argentina, but it's also obvious in many other countries that have a much more developed industrial infrastructure and perhaps a less obvious manifestation of, say, rainforests, as Brazil does. It's also relevant across borders. We think of nature as local. Actually, the deterioration of the rainforests in the Congo will significantly impact the running of the Blue Nile, which of course flows through Egypt. Imagine much of the rainforest in the Congo basin deteriorating. The impact that has on the scale of the Nile and the effect that that would have on Egypt and neighboring countries. And quite rightly, the sovereigns that sit in the Congo basin ask, who's willing to pay for that? Surely there must be some way in which, through international cooperation, markets, policies, regulations, and financial innovation, we can begin to pay for those ecosystem services that have both local effects, but as my example illustrates, also has global effects. So how might sovereign debt markets work if one begins to integrate nature? How might not carbon credits work, but bio-credit markets work if one begins to think about how to pay for those standing forests, whether they're in the Amazon or whether they're in the Congo or indeed in other parts of the world. So in just drawing to a close, yes, nature is infrastructure, but focus on how those global markets need to change so that they don't continue to destroy nature. Moving downstream, how does one begin to understand the different financing mechanisms, public and private, that can support both investment in nature as infrastructure, but also a reduced negative impact of existing economic activities in the way in which nature is sustained and supports us. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Simon. A very panoramic view and insights into these issues. Very struck by the concept of there's no commodity regulator truly looking into this. A very powerful point indeed. I will now pass you on to the Minister. Over to you.
Well, thank you very much. And it's not always common that you sit on panels where you learn something from fellow panelists and also from the topic. And let me praise Eric and JP for the report. You are creating, you're trying to make this mainstream, which is extremely important, making it more common for policymakers, for putting a value, monetizing a value for this makes it extremely important. But let me go back several years, and when we would have annual meetings, we would not necessarily think in this way. I think in the past few years, climate action, be it adaptation, mitigation, and biodiversity and nature, is coming more forcefully. And as countries are designing their strategies with different MDBs, it becomes very important for them to identify risks that are just beyond the typical macro risks. And I like very much how the report is trying to identify this in a way which is not only specific to certain communities in countries, but has a more wide implication on everyone. And I think this is a very important value add that makes it not a localized issue within a country or within a set of countries, but also has systemic implications. So this in itself is extremely powerful and important. For those who have been talking about the mangroves, and it's highlighted in the report, that are in the Red Sea, they're only 20 minutes away. So I invite everyone, as you visited the museum, to also go and see the mangroves along the Ras Mohammed protectorate area, and how the communities there have been positively affected. And this brings us to the concept that we have also been discussing with respect to MDB evolution. Is there a trade-off between the development pathway and the climate pathway? And I think examples such as this, and saying that nature as infrastructure, emphasizing the benefit as well as the risk of leaving this, is also making sure that when we think about development and climate, they are not mutually exclusive, but they are intertwined. And this is, I think, a very powerful message from this report, and also from the work that would come afterwards. One of the maybe suggestions, the World Bank had a very powerful pilot tool that was launched a few years ago, which is the Country Climate Development Report, the CCDRs. And I think that having your work featured in countries' CCDRs particularly, I think would be extremely valuable, because the CCDRs provide at the end a list of projects that are very important for the sovereign or for the private sector or for PPPs, or now, since philanthropy is coming along, philanthropy would also find this extremely powerful ways to provide input in or help in the climate action in different countries. So I think there's a very important synergy when we're talking about MDBs, working together, coordinating with each other. I think your work here, particularly using the data from the World Bank, but also putting input into countries' CCDRs, would be extremely powerful, very, very important, and can provide also opportunities for countries. Let me go to a concept that we launched here at COP27 in Sharm El Sheikh last November, and it was the concept of just financing, that countries need access to quality and quantity of finance, which makes sure that their development pathways are maintained, but also leaving no one behind. And exactly this is what the report is looking at, that the communities themselves that might be affected by natural disasters, how can we make sure that the financing there is available so that no one is left behind? And this is, in that report, there are different modalities of financing. Some of them are the debt swaps that Eric talked about. Some of them are the carbon markets if we're talking about mitigation. And most recently, and it's featured also in our guidebook, are resilience credits with EFAD. How can we, the same way we think about carbon markets and mitigation, how can we think about farming, the food systems, some of the investments that are happening in nature? How can we create resilience credits so that we can motivate private sector investments there? So this is also another opportunity for quantification through the work that has happened here. You mentioned our country platform, NOAFI. NOAFI, which is the nexus of water, food, and energy. It's the Arabic word for fulfilling pledges. And the idea was that through international cooperation, we can fulfill pledges, the climate pledges that the government has, but also the pledges that the international community is trying to find its way to mobilize or to disperse. And in this nexus of water, food, and energy, there are mitigation projects, but adaptation projects in the Nile Delta to avoid sea level rise, and also provide help for communities as well. So in this nexus of water, food, and energy, we have a debt swap. It's with Germany, as Eric pointed out, on mitigation. But this does not mean that we can explore something similar along these lines and maybe showcase it as well going forward. I think also something very important, and this is one of the strengths of AIIB, is the South-South cooperation in providing many of these examples and having platforms where countries, the case of Bangladesh, which you provided a band that goes a while back. This, I think, is also quite inspirational for other countries, and there's lots of learnings that can be pushed forward. So again, I find this extremely useful for practitioners, for policymakers who are thinking about the future, and I think something extremely important is that it makes what seems to be a localized small problem in some countries very much into the macro picture, which affects cost of borrowing, affects future prospects, and I just hope that it doesn't make its way very fast to the rating agencies yet, Eric, because we have too many risks to worry about as it stands. But let's say that this also provides an opportunity for investment, an opportunity for more global cooperation, and we just came from the Governors Roundtable where there's a call for more grant money, and this grant money can come for project preparation, but there's a window with philanthropy, and I think it is work such as this which opens doors for them to come in, and it will help countries because it will bring down macro risk as you identified in the report. I conclude by saying this is our Sharm El Sheikh guidebook for just financing. It's on our website. We have some copies, but this also has a list of how to do the blended finance. It's the how, not why, and it has a lot of input for some of the very practical discussions we're having here at the annual meetings. Thank you.
Minister, thank you very much. We are now going to have a panel discussion, and we'll open the floor to you. And let me just give you a reminder of what Eric said. This is really about stakeholder engagement. We want to hear your views, so please do not be shy of stepping in and asking questions. Minister, I really want to start with you, because in many ways, some would say that the climate issue and the biodiversity issue are not being treated as well. They're being siloed, one off the other. And your program, NUFI, that you spoke about, really sort of interlinks biodiversity, climate, food, people. And we have this Just Transition book right next to me, so I'm very keen to get my hands on it. Tell us a bit more, and tell the audience a bit more about what it is that nature markets can learn from this experience, this very rich experience that you have.
Thank you very much. In the lead up to COP, the government put together its long-term strategy, the LTS. We all get to learn these acronyms. So Egypt's climate strategy 2050. And in that climate strategy, it is split up into the green infrastructure, the gray infrastructure, the sustainable transport, etc. So it was split up into different sectors. And in our case, we have several protected areas, the Ras Mohammed here in the Red Sea. We have some in Hurghada. So these natural endowments are being affected by climate change. And there is work that we have been doing with UNDP, with USAID, with many of our development partners to quantify how much is needed to protect, but also the technologies that are needed in order to protect these natural endowments. So this is an integral part of our country climate strategy. So the first item has to be government commitment, identifying that these are important interventions that are required, and have them in these long-term strategies. And also, there is an element within the nationally determined contributions that does address the impact of climate change on many of these protected areas. So that's a very important backdrop for the work that we have done. We took a number of projects and put them in this platform, the NUFI platform. So these are not all the projects that Egypt needs, it's just a subset of 9. And the idea was to create our own version of the just energy transition platforms that the G7 pushed out for South Africa, Indonesia, and Vietnam. And this is how this platform was created. These are high priority projects, decarbonizing gas plants to use renewables, and also water desalination for the water pillar, and then of course agriculture being so important for food security and so forth. So so NOAFI is a subset of the long-term strategy that has identified including biodiversity. We have also most recently with our development partners embarked on a very important Red Sea initiative. It's again to look into the Red Sea, the coral reefs, do a lot of work with respect to the technology and so forth, but also the communities that are affected by this. So this is again the leaving no one behind element. That at the end of the day, climate is a people's issue, not just the finance and not just the impact and so forth. So that's why I say that South-South cooperation is quite important, because these are models that can be replicated. So what is it that we have done that others might follow? And for us as well, we've learned from other countries in putting this together. And let me say that we've been able to do this based on 3 C's. There's commitment from the government, there's clarity with respect to the projects, and there's credibility that we have with the international community.
No, thank you for that. And I think the issue that you brought up, the importance of people, is actually absolutely quite fundamental to get buy-in from local communities on this. Aban, let me come to you. I was very struck by the continuum that Eric had put up and that you spoke about. In effect, going from grey infrastructure to green and to natural infrastructure. In an ideal world for you, where would we like to be? I'm gathering that there are almost 50 shades of green inside. Paint me a picture of what that infrastructure would look like. What is needed now? We are hearing about these showcase projects. What more could be done to truly deliver on helping biodiversity?
I think to shift from what is today practically, I would say 80% of the world is grey infrastructure. Maybe if you're lucky, 10%, 15 would be a green, and 5% or less natural. And it's probably natural infrastructure, not because it was planned that way, but because people just did it traditionally, Bangladesh being an example. Obviously, we should change that percentage. You'll always have grey infrastructure. As I said, for certain things, buildings, although even there you can have wood and stuff, but still. But there are certain things that grey infrastructure, you will never be able to replace steel when you need a certain level of load bearing. It's just it's a given. But there's a lot in between that and green infrastructure, and then natural infrastructure. It's the shift we need to make. And in making that shift, you're also going to be addressing a lot of the other things about, the fact that we're undervaluing nature. You'll make it a much stronger economic proposition. You'll make it a much stronger financial proposition. But having said that, I think there is a reason why it hasn't happened beyond just the mindset and the need to start looking at things differently, and the impacts of climate change and the loss of biodiversity. I think we made a fundamental mistake in Rio when we brought 2 conventions out separately, climate and biodiversity. They should never have been separated. It should have been one convention for both right from the beginning. By separating them, you got a certain inevitability of market forces taking over climate, because carbon is much easier to measure and therefore to create a financial value. Biodiversity has always been, life is not easy to define and value. That's precisely, the problem. How do you value a frog? How do you value, now that air, clean air has a value in terms of its impact on life forms and health of all humans and other species. But how do you actually value a fungus which has never really been examined or analyzed in terms of its potential medicinal value, or maybe just its value to an ecosystem or to other life forms? It's a much more complex system of valuation, but I do believe that if a codependency between climate and biodiversity had been created right from the beginning, we would have spent a lot more time trying to find the values. So the matrices don't exist in many cases. It's not easy to create a market when you can't price it. And so you're looking at a change which, partly through our own creation and partly through the very much more difficult aspect of what you're dealing with. So when you say, how soon can we move the spectrum, a great deal depends on how quick the markets can change, how quick the technology comes in, how good the science is, and how much you're willing to invest in it. And so any kind of MDB has that sort of challenge, apart from the good intent, which I do believe AIIB has.
Hello. Excellent points. Simon, I want to pick up on that point because it is about the metrics. There is no GHG equivalent in this field, and there's no carbon price. So what can be done to really start valuing nature, or what is being done?
Can I take a two-step? Because I just wanted to add to your comments. So I've spent the last 6 years living in Amsterdam. So my ground floor is 6 meters below sea level. And the Netherlands obviously is famous and infamous for its management of water, both from the North Sea and from the Rhine, coming from the Alps. So it has two different flood problems. And there's been a remarkable shift over the last 7 or 8 years from hard infrastructure, grey, to soft infrastructure or nature. That actually they've understood that they can't win the battle through force. And so now the use of nature as infrastructure, the use of extensive flooding zones, the management of the flow of water rather than the push against it with purely concrete, actually is the direction that the Netherlands has convincingly gone. And I think as a world leader in water management, that's a lesson to be drawn. I know that's not the question you asked me, but just to add in.
No, good. I don't mind it.
And then on the issue of management, I'm going to sort of agree but disagree. Firstly, we don't know how to measure climate. We only know how to measure carbon. And so when you look at the task force for climate-related financial disclosure for the financial sector, it's almost nothing to do with climate. It's entirely to do with carbon. And the more you move towards adaptation, the closer you get to measuring things in the same way that you're thinking about nature. That's the sort of the big crossover, if you like. So firstly, it's not that we've figured out the climate measurement story and we haven't figured out the nature story. We've figured out one piece just about of the climate story, which is carbon. Secondly, of course, it's completely true. Biodiversity is the quintessential complexity. It's the original complexity. And so you can't measure biodiversity by going, there's a tree plus a bird, plus a marshland, it doesn't aggregate in that way. I'm treading on the area you have far greater expertise than me. So really measuring the complexity of the way in which these different elements interact helps one begin to understand more about the state of health of biodiversity. And then I would simply say, yes, it's hard, but certainly our message consistently to the financial community is that there is absolutely no measurement excuse to not getting started. So there is ample ability to look at a financial institution's portfolio and to understand broadly what its impact on biodiversity is, perhaps not to excruciating scientific detail, but certainly sufficiently to begin to manage and change the way in which that impact works. And then secondly, although we are deficient in data about biodiversity in many respects in many parts of the world, we see a small handful of highly sophisticated, AI-driven analytic platforms that are increasingly able to approximate the state of biodiversity health, even in areas where there's no grounded data. You know, the biodiversity intactness index, the biodiversity complexity index from ETH Zurich and others. So I think this is a challenge, but it is not a challenge that should stop us in our tracks by any means, and I think there's incredible innovation in the biodata space almost on a daily basis.
Eric, before we open it up to the audience, let me ask you, and I go back again to the continuum, where do you see AIB going along that continuum? And how fast?
How fast? Yeah. No.
And will the bankers like it?
This is the beauty of working for AIB, that we are a young institution. We don't have a huge legacy. We can think fresh about ideas. And so I think our joint commitment, I think, from, is not only the economics department, but also, many other parts of the bank. And we have the Sunny here, who is responsible for biodiversity and nature in the strategy and policy department. So there's very much a commitment to try to build this into the DNA of the bank. So, and when I spoke initially about nature as infrastructure, it's a way of thinking about infrastructure. It's a kind of call it a set of glasses to look at things. Minister Rania said, you're learning something all the time, but I had no idea that there was this ecosystem co-benefit from the mangroves in Egypt. If we start looking at things, what is the problem we are having here? Is there a natural solution? Is there a solution in which we can bring in nature on top of other things? It's that thought process that we are trying to promote in the bank. And once we have that in our DNA, I think it's going to change everything. I agree that we nature cannot deliver everything, but actually I think it can deliver much more than we can imagine today. And that's really what nature's infrastructure is about.
Okay, I was going to open it up to the audience. I will come to you. I just have one final question. Please don't look so upset. We will come to you. I love the eagerness. But let me ask this. In terms of co-benefits, we are beginning to see people pricing co-benefits, all the time. Are we not scared of having almost biodiversity washing? We've seen social washing take place. We've seen greenwashing take place.
Yeah.
What are the safeguards?
No, so I think the metrics problem is definitely there, but I think, as Simon was saying, first, it's not 100% solved for climate, and I think what I have learned actually through this exercise and also my JPs and my discussions is, that there are actually techniques now you can understand using geospatial data, using algorithms to what is exactly the health of this ecosystem or this forest, what is actually the capacity of this forest to absorb carbon? What is you can also get sense of the intactness. So things are moving very fast here, and it's, before I went into this area, I couldn't have imagined that there are so many tools that are available, and we just need to make them available or bring them in on a consistent basis. And I think eventually we'll be able to contract on this in the same way as we contract on carbon today, and maybe even better, because we know that there's been a lot of, as you say, greenwashing. Maybe here we have a chance to measure things, right, even better than we have with.
Sir, over to you.
Made my day today. I'm Eugene Simonon from Rivers Without Boundaries Coalition. About 2017, we were the first to heavily criticize AIB for the absence of proactive approach in biodiversity conservation, and we explicitly suggested that the new environmental policy should include something about investing in sustaining ecosystem services and ecosystems as such. And lo and behold, it was accommodated in a very minor way, but in the preamble to the environmental policy there is, with a specific example of wetlands attached to make it. As I see today, there is the next, finally, 6 years later, the next step is being painfully made, which is greatly soothed to see. But, and many questions I had, you already asked and answered sitting while you almost exhausted my questions. That's an amazing thing, you know.
And the disappointed look you gave me, it was rather scary.
Yeah. That was the last question.
I was going to go into
the new type of safeguards was the last question I had. So my last question, which I definitely probably will address to Eric, sorry Eric, it's your question, is that I've seen a lot of brilliant innovations discussed at previous AIIB AGMs. I've been to 5 of them. Each AGM has a highlight of a new sort of bright path to be taken in innovation field. I must say that I don't see much of that materialized to date. So, and normally when at the next AGM or in the middle I ask actual bank managers or whoever I can get hold of, the answer is, but you know, we have members and they have their specific needs and it somehow didn't fly with them. So why do you think that what we're discussing today will fly with the members and they will borrow money for that, not just get grants as was properly indicated by...
Sir, you know I adore you.
Yeah.
But let's just...
Yeah, that's it. That's the question. Why would they borrow money for that?
Thank you, and I think we should recognize organizations like yours having put pressure on MDBs and us in particular, and you know, most of these institutions are like oil tankers. It takes a long time for them to change. I think we should be smart and nimble, and we should be able to bring in these ideas. And I really mean it seriously that there has been a fundamental internalization, I would say, of these ideas. And you know what. So we have in parallel, or as a result of this, there is now a report that Sani here is in charge of for trying to say, what does it now mean for AIIB? What are the specific measures? How do we integrate this into our different interventions? So will our members take, well, we have one member here, you know, Egypt. Obviously, Egypt may be, an avant-garde when it comes to thinking about these issues and articulating them and so on. But what we have tried to show here is that there's already, a lot of examples among our members. We have several projects in the pipeline with very strong elements of biodiversity and nature-based solution. What we want to do with this report is to put not only on ourselves, but also help our countries put on these glasses and realize that these investments using nature-based solutions are cheaper, smarter, more sustainable over time, maybe more just in the sense that Minister Rania was talking about. So I'm very happy to come back next year. You have been to more annual meetings than I have, and you put me that question to me next year. I will promise you that we will have made some inroad on this, because there is really a very genuine commitment from management on this.
Okay. Any more questions from the audience?
By the way, I should say that our president loves to use nature as infrastructure. Almost every speech he makes now, which, is I think...
Which delights you, Eric?
Which delights
you, Eric. I'm
me.
saving you here. Yes.
Hello? Yes, I'm Khalid Ahmed. I'm from Egypt. My questions will be to Mr. Eric and Her Excellency Dr. Rania. First one to Mr. Eric. Are you going to put TNFD as a tool to govern your communication with private sectors, corporations, or lending as a tool for the next step or the next decade to be put from TCFD to TNFD as a tool to reduce the limit or the ratio of lending put it on the private sectors or governance? This one for Dr. Rania, please. Are you going to use TNFD to give the private sector some supporting as some positive increments or positive fund investments, cooperations, if they put investments in the nature or biodiversity, it will be supporting for private sector or investors, foreigners or local, to work on these projects. So I think this tool will be support the private sector to encourage to use this one. Thanks so much.
Thank you, and I think this is exactly the kind of thing that will be covered in this report. But maybe we should explain for the audience exactly what we're talking about. Maybe you can...
Just very briefly, so TNFD, the Task Force for Nature-Related Financial Disclosure, I will test you at the end. So it's a framework that was released after 2 years of work last week at the New York Stock Exchange as part of the UN Climate Week. It sets out the underpinnings of a standard for financial institutions and non-financial corporations to measure and report on their nature-related financial risks and impacts.
Yeah, and I think we spoke earlier about integrating climate and nature, and I think what's happening now with these new standards that have been released by the International Sustainable Standards Board is trying to integrate these two bodies, the one that deals with nature, the one that deals with climate, into one coherent system. And I think that's a very important part of getting this buy-in from financial markets and bringing in finance into this. And when we go to our clients, our members, I think having that framework is going to make it much more likely that we can attract private investment into this as well.
Two things. I go back to when I was Minister of Tourism, there was one private sector company that had a place close to Fiala temple. So it was protecting the heritage and also the natural habitat there, and we were able to help them get financing and linked what their work with the SDGs. So this was 2019. Fast forward, I think that today, through the Global Compact of the UN and so forth, there's more information that is being put out. That particular tool we have not yet familiarized our private sector with. Nonetheless, there's more when it comes to, and not just on nature, but adaptation when it comes to water, food systems, and of course mitigation more. This concept of the blended finance tools, where we can use some of this concessional and grant component to crowd in private sector investment. So this is stuff that we are doing, not on the biodiversity as detailed and as detailed as we were discussing here in the panel, but I think it's messages from here onwards that makes this more entrenched in the discussions and gives us as well more tools to be able to discuss with the private sector. But I will look forward to getting more details from Simon and Eric on that particular one that was issued 2 weeks ago, and then see how we can maybe roll it out here. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We have 30 seconds left, and given the spirit of engagement, I'm happy to take one more question from the floor. Okay. If not, I suggest we all go see the mangroves and Ras Mohammed. I suggest that's what we do for the next 30 seconds. Let me thank you all. Let me thank the panel for a wonderful conversation. And let me thank the audience for the spirit and the engagement. And sir, thank you for the fire there. We enjoyed that very much. Thank you all.